Hey everyone, ahlan wa sahlan fikum. I'm really excited for today's video, and honestly I can't believe I haven't covered this topic already. Today we're going to talk about Palestinian place names. Many of you probably know that cities and towns in Palestine have different names in English versus in Arabic. Sometimes the differences are subtle, but sometimes they're huge. Either way, there's always a really interesting story behind it, so let's get into it right now. Okay, so this isn't really going to be a complete inventory of Palestinian towns because our focus is ultimately on language, and obviously many Palestinian towns are still known by their Arabic names in English. That's especially true for comparatively newer towns, such as Ramallah. That's because many of the cities that have different names in English were important in classical antiquity and in the religious narratives that eventually reached Europe. So the reason for the difference is that the European names for these towns evolved separately from the Arabic names. Conversely, towns that weren't prominent during that period have kept their Arabic names in English, as in the case of Haifa, which didn't really enter the English language. Compare that to Accra, which is right across the bay from Haifa. Today, Haifa is by far the greater and more significant of these two cities, but Accra is one of the oldest continually inhabited towns in history and was far more important historically. So that's why in English we've inherited and evolved the word Accra, which is distinct from the Arabic Akka. This isn't limited to Palestine, by the way. Most of Lebanon's notable cities have unique English names, hence Tarabulus, Jbeil, Saida, and Sur, all of which are famous ancient Phoenician cities. In a way, it's not that different from the way that we have different words in English for certain cities like Munich or Cologne, which in German are München and Köln. There are some counterexamples though. For example, Gaza or Gaza was very important historically and even in classical antiquity, but probably due to its lack of religious significance, it has kept its original name with only a slight modification. Interestingly, the really significant city of Bethlehem is very similar to its Arabic name, Bethlehem. Although it's worth noting that in other European languages, the word is much more distorted, as in the Spanish name Belén. To be fair, the inhabitants of these ancient cities didn't speak Arabic yet when these towns were founded, so in some cases the Arabic names are themselves adaptations of other names. For example, the town of Tiberias, founded by the Romans, eventually evolved into Tabariya. My favorite example of this though is the city of Nablus. Yes, Nablus, which actually descends from the name the Romans gave to the town, Neapolis. So etymologically speaking, Nablus is actually the sister city of Naples in Italy. I think this is a great example of how names organically evolve over time and how the question of who the name belongs to is frankly a moot point. There's no denying that Nablus is the city's Arabic name, yet it was installed by the Romans, who replaced the Canaanite name of the town with a Greek word because Neapolis is actually Greek. While some Arabic names are direct adaptations of Roman names like Nablus or even Tarabulus in Lebanon, others are better thought of as evolutions of earlier names. After all, some of these towns are so ancient, like Akka, that the origin of the name is entirely unknown. Even though Akka is the Arabic name, it's not actually an Arabic word. Another example though is the city of Jericho, which is another city of great significance that has its own name in English. In Arabic though, Jericho is actually called Ariha, which in the dialect is just pronounced as Riha. What's funny is that there's already a separate word, riha, in the dialect, which comes from the standard Arabic word ra'iha, meaning aroma. However, these words are sort of related as they actually have the same root. In fact, the word ariha is actually a cognate of the Canaanite word ri'ah, meaning fragrant. It's essentially the same name, but in a different language. I know that sounds kind of like a paradox. How can it be the same name in a different language? Well, it's the same as how we have The Hague in English, Den Haag in Dutch, and La Haya in Spanish. The same name in different languages. In the case of Jericho, as the locals adopted the Arabic language, they naturally started to say the name of their city in their new language. But since the Canaanite and Arabic languages are cousins, the essence of the name never changed. That's why, in a way, the Canaanite Re'ah still lives on in Riha. Actually, Bethlehem is an interesting example of the same thing, but gone wrong. If you look at the Arabic name, it looks like it means house of meat. That's because the original pronunciation of the name was Beit Lechem, meaning the temple of Lechem. In fact, Lechem is the Canaanite name of the ancient Mesopotamian god Lachmu. But the sound khe in the Canaanite language actually corresponds to ha in Arabic. So that's why the temple of Lachmu is now house of meat, basically due to a pure coincidence. Speaking of Bethlehem, another name that's different in Arabic but still kind of recognizable is in Nasra, or Nazareth in English. Obviously another site of great religious significance. You can immediately tell this name is a more recent innovation due to the use of the article, which is obviously a very Arabic thing. In fact, modern Arabic place names tend to be definite, even if it's not obvious in English. For example, the city of Cairo is actually Al-Qahira in Arabic. Even Ramallah, it's in the Idafa construction, so it means the hill of God. As you can see, it's definite. While the names of some towns like Ariha organically shifted, towns of special religious significance were given new names to reflect that significance. In the case of al-Nasra, the use of a distinctly Arabic name arguably reflects the importance of Jesus in Islam, which is after all how the Arabic language entered Palestine. In any case, there are two other examples of this that are much more drastic. Let's start with Al-Khalil. Do you know where that is? In English we say Hebron. This is a perfect example of what I'm trying to say though, because the name Al-Khalil obviously has nothing to do with the word Hebron. Rather, the name, meaning the true friend, is a reference to the prophet Abraham, to whom the Abrahamic religions owe their name. And the reason this name was applied to Hebron is, well, that Abraham's tomb is located there. Anyway, now your favorite city. I'm sure you all know this already, but the name of Jerusalem in Arabic is actually Al-Quds. The name means the holy in Arabic. After all, it's the third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina. Although the reference is originally Islamic, by the way, Palestinian Christians also say Al-Quds, and the same thing applies to Al-Khalil and so on. There's actually another name for Jerusalem in Arabic which is more directly religious, Bayt al-Maqdis, meaning the house of the holy, which I believe refers to the Al-Aqsa compound and could be expanded to mean Jerusalem in general. By the way, we can use the name of these towns to refer to people from that area, in the same way that in English we say a Londoner or a Parisian and so on. In Arabic, you can do that in many cases by adding the ya adjective marker. So someone from Al-Khalil is Khalili. But some words undergo slight changes. For example, someone from Gaza is Ghazawi. Someone from Nablus is Nabulsi. Or in the case of Al-Quds though, the name is actually derived from Bayt al-Maqdis. So people from Jerusalem are called Maqdisi. Anyway, those are the names of the main Arabic towns that have different names in English, mostly due to the cultural legacy of classical antiquity and Christianity in Europe. But there's another dimension to the story too, because as Palestine switched hands from the Ottomans to the British during World War I, the political leadership of the newly arrived Zionists started thinking more and more about how to justify their claim to the territory. So they started drawing maps of Palestine, or rather Eretz Israel, where they would link contemporary Palestinian settlements to ancient biblical towns and rename them accordingly. Sometimes it's hard to see the impact of this process because after all, in English we do use those historical names already. But take the example of Asqalan. In English, the historical name of this town is usually Ascalon, but today we see it mostly written as Ashkelon, which is the name chosen by the Zionist Rename Commission, and it's the official Israeli name of the town today. What's interesting is that while we've seen many cases where the Arabic name of a town is not used in English, in this case the Zionist renaming has actually replaced the English historical term. I think for many people Ashkelon is easy to accept because it seems to recover the more ancient name of the town, but from the standpoint of historical linguistics, Ashkelon is actually more different to the original than Asqalan. Either way, I don't actually think that's the most important part of the story. Rather, it's the fact that the town that the Zionists renamed Ashkelon is actually not the ancient site of Asqalan. What they renamed was actually the Palestinian village of Al-Majdal, which was established in the 15th century and is located near to the ruins of the original Asqalan, which are outside the city. So the objective of calling the town Ashkelon was about erasing the Palestinian town from the map and creating the impression of continuity between ancient history and a contemporary political project. The same thing happened all over Palestine. When in 1899 the Ottomans decided to establish the outpost of Bir as-Sab'a, the area was completely deserted and the first governor had to live in a tent. When the Zionists captured the town though, they renamed it as Bir Sheva, the ancient town whose ruins were a few kilometers away. Even though the town was hardly older than me, the new name gave it a sense of being a continuation of the ancient town. As a matter of fact, they tried to do the same thing with Nablus. On the early Zionist maps, and even on Israeli maps today, Nablus is actually labeled as Shechem, an ancient town whose ruins are actually located in the Palestinian village of Balata, next to Nablus. Obviously, labeling the contemporary city of Nablus itself as Shechem is purely about staking a political claim, and the only reason Nablus isn't called Shechem today, in the same way that Al-Majdal became Ashkelon, is just that the Zionists didn't capture Nablus. So that's the story of Palestinian place names. We've talked about language, we talked about religion, we talked about history. I think that just about covers everything, at least as an overview. There's actually a lot written about this topic, so if you want to learn more, I highly recommend the book Hidden Histories by Bassem Raad, which is probably the most fascinating book I've ever read about the history of ancient Palestine and how it relates to the names that places have today. Anyway, wear a mask and I'll see you next time.
اهلا حبايبي وشكرا للجماعه اللي بيحضروا القناه. اذا بدكم تكملوا تشوفوا هالفيديوز اعملوا سبسكرايب، واذا شفتوني مؤخرا تفضلوا روحوا شوفوا الفيديوز الماضيه بالبلاي ليست، وتذكروا اني عملت مصادر لتعلم اللهجه الفلسطينيه تقدروا تلاقوها بالموقع تبعي اللي مكتوب تحت بالديسكربشن، ونشوفكم المره الجايه.